Gary, thanks very much indeed for making the time to have a chat today. So you made a fairly radical decision recently. You know, you were kind of at the crest of the wave. WAYRA is so well known, not just WAYRA here in London, but also with some of the other WAYRA accelerators, the one in Cheltenham we know, and the AI and blockchain accelerator up in Edinburgh. And just before Christmas, in fact, I went along to the pitch day at the Edinburgh facility. But it's got a great reputation. But you decided as CEO for WAYRA in the UK to pack it in and do something else. Why?
Well, I think for me, it's kind of, I never really expected to go work for a corporate. And when I got there, it was because they needed an entrepreneur to kind of bring a little bit of the entrepreneurial mindset to WAYRA from the very beginning, because they didn't want it to be too corporate. But I think that after being there for about 8 years, I felt like I did what I wanted to do. I learned what I needed to learn. And I felt like I could do more. And I'm not the kind of person that ever feels the need to be in the same place for more than like a few years. Because I find it boring after a little bit of time. And the worst thing in life for me is to be bored. So even though it meant kind of like getting out of my comfort zone, and where I was very comfortable, it kind of like has left me feeling reinvigorated. Like now I'm doing something full-time that I 100% care about, which is the Nest, focusing on helping founders who are usually ignored to kind of get the same sorts of opportunities that we provided in WAYRA.
Okay, so we'll come to the Nest in just a second, but just before leaving WAYRA, you hinted that you were getting a little bit frustrated, and that perhaps the types of organisation that you were working with were of a type. Do you think that it is the case that accelerators kind of act as like a sausage machine, that a lot of the businesses are quite similar?
No, I don't think that I ever kind of got bored of the startups. I think that kind of working for a large corporate has its pros and its cons, and I felt like I had already gotten all the pros that I needed from working in a large corporate. But I think that working with the startups, that was like the best part of the job. And I think that if the question is, do accelerators actually provide value? I think the answer is absolutely yes. Like now that I'm back in the role of being the entrepreneur, which is actually the role that I prefer, because I think the thing about a corporate is it's kind of like very comfortable, but like maybe I like a bit more risk. I like a lot more upside, and maybe a corporate just provides you a lot of comfort. But I think that when you're a startup, you need someone to kind of usually give you that first helping hand. And now that I'm raising money again, you realize there are not that many people that want to give you that helping hand at the beginning. I think if anything, what's happened in a lot of ecosystems, but particularly in Europe, is that a lot of investors are moving a little bit later stage to where the risk has diminished somewhat.
Absolutely.
So that means then kind of like that first bit where you just have an idea and maybe you have like one partner, one co-founder, whatever the case may be, and you need a little bit of support to get you to that through the product development to the first customers. I don't think that there's that much support for that in Europe.
Yeah, and I think that situation has been almost exacerbated a little bit as a result of COVID, hasn't it? Because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that companies that haven't raised a seed round, for example, are finding it much more difficult because a lot of VCs are following the money rather than taking fresh and new risks. Is that your anecdotal experience as well?
I mean, I think that like I'm very privileged in the sense that being in WAYRA for 8 years means that I developed really great relationships with lots of investors. I don't think that a lot of founders kind of start off from that point. But even for me, it's difficult to raise money. So I sometimes wonder what it'd be like if like I actually didn't know everyone and I didn't have like, some understanding of how the game is actually played. So I do think that explains why accelerators are so useful, because a lot of times if you don't know how the game is played and you don't know who the real players are, then you're not going to have any chance of winning. And good accelerators should help you to kind of figure that out relatively quickly. And I think that right now what's going on as well is, a lot of VCs, again, I think that the issue in Europe is that a lot of VCs really aren't venture capitalists. They got into the game because they're former bankers, whatever the case may be, and somehow they got government funding to be able to launch a fund. I think that means then that when you get to these crisis moments, either they've never been through them before, or they don't really fit within their kind of risk profile. And so then you do see them kind of running to even safer moment, which is like, let me just double down on the companies that I have in my portfolio that look like probable winners, and let me forget about even companies within my portfolio that I'm not entirely sure about, much less new companies. So I think that you do see the kind of VCs with lower risk profiles and probably less real entrepreneurial interest or aptitude or empathy kind of moving away a little bit. But some people are saying to me that as COVID has kind of now become the new normal, things are getting a little bit back to normal.
One of the other people that we interviewed as part of this program was a lady called Elizabeth McBride, and she's a writer, does a variety of things, but she writes for MIT Review. And one of the articles that she wrote recently suggested that the big US, the Bay Area VCs, typically invested in a very archetypal type of business, typically run by entrepreneurs who came through the Ivy League MBA programs, and the investment was very similar and samey, obviously in the hope that they would get return, but the people who they were investing in were quite similar. Is that similar in Europe, or do you think we're very different from that American model?
No, I think that it's the same. I think that the numbers are something like in the US, 40% of all VCs went to Harvard or Stanford. And if you went to Yale, where I went to, like, you're at a disadvantage, much less if you didn't go to an Ivy League school. And so the issue is that it is a kind of very closed network, and it's difficult for you to kind of get involved or to get supported if you don't belong to the network, because everything depends on warm intros. Of course, if you generate lots of traction, you have the hottest startup in the world, people will follow, but at least at the beginning, the early stages, when you don't necessarily have all of those indices or indications, it's going to be a lot more difficult. I think Europe is very similar. They've done the research here, and it tends to be that most people have some sort of like Oxford or Cambridge background or some sort of MBA. From like a top school like INSEAD or LBS, whatever the case may be. Definitely tends to be disproportionately white male, upper middle class, or however the classification system you use, but means that you have enough money to not need to work for a reasonable period of time, and that the very first investors that you have can be your friends and your family, who might be able to put together somewhere in the vicinity of 50 to 250,000 pounds to help you get the business off the ground before you even start to really look at outside investors. So anywhere you go in the world, it still is definitely a game that is for people who have the ability to take risks, and that means people who have the money to take risks, and their family networks take risks, and also they belong to the networks where you can kind of, through a friend of a friend, reach the person that makes the decision about whether or not to fund you.
Yeah, so it's still bank of mom and dad really is the ultimate seed capital.
And then the networks that mean that you can kind of find a warm intro to the person who can then write the next check relatively easily.
Now, there's another way to look at this as well, though. There's the fact that, as you say, a lot of MBAs are going into the funnel, but can we say confidently that enough people are out there and hungry to get funding and want to be entrepreneurs, but are not even making it into the funnel? We don't get to know about them, that the VCs don't get to hear about them. Are we feeding enough in order to get enough out?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the numbers are something like in the US, only 0.05% of startups get funding. That means 99.9%, 99.99, whatever, 99.95% will never get funding. So that's kind of part of the problem with VC, that like because you're only looking for these outliers, these kind of unicorns as they call them, then it means that the game is to reject 99% of the people that come in that you see. So there's no question that there's a funnel there. It's just a question of like who you accept into the funnel and who you reject. And I think the other interesting data point is that usually about like 90% of VCs actually get it wrong most of the time. So they don't actually return the 3x that is needed to their limited partners. So it's not the case that they have like some sort of mystical ability to divine wonderful startups. It just means that they keep investing in what they've always invested in, and 90% of the times they get it wrong. Yeah.
And in fact, the data bears that out as well, because they say that, I don't know where I heard this and it could be wrong and I can't certainly remember the source, but only like something like 1 in every 6,000 funded startups get to IPO or major multiple trade sales. So it is very much like pinning the list as to which one will be successful. So if, as you say, it's heavily skewed, it does indicate that perhaps there is clear clear bias in the system, if not in the decision making, but certainly the system is flawed in some way.
And I think the other part of your question was, are they investing in the wrong things? Probably. I mean, because it's like, I think usually they're chasing trends. So someone will say, oh, AI is going to be huge, and then they all run out to chase an AI startup. But maybe the companies that made the most money aren't AI startups. They're like, an e-commerce startup or kind of like a social network. It's not clear to me if at those points in time, back in the late 1990s or early 2000s, that everyone knew a priori that Facebook was going to be the next big thing. MySpace had just been bought by News Corp for about $500 million. I don't know if people were actively predicting Facebook until they started to see the user metrics and they're like, wow, there's something there. But if you had said, okay, we're looking for a new social network, so we should all go out there and find it, I'm not sure if that would have worked. So I think that the majority of VCs are usually working kind of, backwards. They're not really aware, I don't think. I think the really good ones can kind of see things before they actually happen, and maybe a lot of other folks are just chasing trends that are already probably, too late.
Yeah. So that brings us neatly to the next question. Tell us about the Nest. What is it, and what's it trying to achieve?
Yeah, so I think that the kind of basic premise of the Nest is that everyone deserves the opportunity to get this sort of entrepreneurial support, the kind that we would have given at WAYRA or any of these other accelerators. But instead of only focusing on 10 companies and hoping that one of them is going to give you outsized returns, focus on the other 99% that you would normally reject, right? So that's kind of the idea, because within that 99%, it tends to be disproportionately people who are not rich white men. So that means that it's people of color, it's women, it's people who didn't go to Harvard or Stanford in the US, or Oxford and Cambridge or INSEAD in the UK. And there are a lot of really great people with a lot of talent who should also be given the chance to become entrepreneurs and should also get the chance to get access to education, entrepreneurial education, to learn the terminology. They should get access to mentors, and they should get access to financing. And it shouldn't be that the key criterion for determining whether or not you get it is if you were lucky enough to go to Harvard or Stanford or Oxford or Cambridge. That's kind of ridiculous. So that's what we're doing. It's basically a platform that you can think of it almost like an accelerator in your pocket. It does all of the same sorts of things that I would have been focusing on at WAYRA, but it kind of makes it digital. So I think that's the other conceit of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, is that we tell startups that you have to think about how you're going to disrupt traditional businesses by bringing technology, but somehow we think that doesn't apply to what we do, right? So VC is very old school. It's like a bunch of usually white guys sitting behind a desk investing in other white guys not behind a desk. But then the relationship is very kind of manual. It's like calling on the phone, it's going to my office, whatever the case may be. There's no use of technology, and there's no idea of how to scale it. So I think what we're trying to say is we can actually democratize a lot of the best elements of entrepreneurship and accelerators and venture capital, but to do that we need to use technology. And if we can democratize it properly, then it means that anyone, anywhere can get the same sort of opportunity as right now only people who are lucky enough to get into WAYRA, or who have the family connections, the money, and went to the right schools, can get at most of the accelerators in the UK and in the US as well.
You mentioned, you did say white guys, and there is a possible criticism here that we don't want to create sort of identity politics in the world of funding and venture capital, and of course a lot of the most socially deprived parts of the United Kingdom are 99.9% white, the northeast of England and so on. But presumably you want to eke out the talent and the entrepreneurial nous from those places too. So it's not about identity, it's more about ability.
Well, so I'm going to push back. I think everything is identity. I think that for us to say that where you went to school usually doesn't tell you something about your identity, I think is mistaken, right? And I think that I'll just leave it at that. And I think that the people who have the resources usually have a certain identity, and that's why I'm very careful to not say white guys only. I'm saying white guys from a very particular social segment. You can be a white guy in the US, but if you didn't go to Harvard and Stanford, you only went to Yale or Princeton, you're still going to be discriminated against.
Yeah, and social mobility in America is appalling. It's almost impossible to break out unless you get a good education, and of course that means Ivy League.
So it's kind of to me, it's the intersection. It's not just skin color. Skin color by itself is irrelevant. I agree with you that one of the things that we saw when we did the programs in Edinburgh or Cheltenham or Manchester is that it's not just race. It's race, and then sometimes it's socioeconomic, sometimes it's gender, sometimes it's disability, sometimes it's something else. But there are a lot of different isms, which are elements of your identity. If you talk to a person who's disabled, they're not going to say, oh, being disabled is not part of my identity. It is a very important part of who they are and how they define themselves. But what we're saying is all of these elements of your identity that right now prevent you from getting funding should not prevent you from getting funding. And we can use technology. And so, yeah, I'm the first one to say that, like, just as we did in Manchester or whatever, Cheltenham, everyone everywhere should get like access to this. It's not about race, it's not about gender, but we don't need to deny the fact that the numbers are there. Black founders only get less than 1% of the funding in the US, despite being 13% of the population. Black women get like 0.02% of the funding. So we can sit here and say, okay, well, it's about ability, but no, there's something else at play as well, usually, because to your earlier point, the way that a lot of VCs try to justify it is they call it pattern recognition. So what they say is, if I saw that Mark Zuckerberg made a lot of money for some venture capital funds, and he is a rich Jewish guy, white, who went to Harvard and dropped out, all of a sudden they all start looking for rich white guys who went to Harvard and dropped out. That actually was a thing for a little bit. You know, I think Peter Thiel funded that to kind of figure out, like, can we get these people who are these outliers before they go to finish college and get like normalized, but they only have to go to certain colleges. You're not going to get them if they went to like a Rutgers, for example. It has to be Harvard. So what I'm saying to you is, like, yeah, of course, we're going to fight against all of that. It's not just skin color, but skin color is one of them as well.
Now, there's one of the consequences of COVID was not just around the issue of lockdown and certain sectors suffering and so on, but there was a number of other issues that kind of bubbled up to the surface. Certainly the Black Lives Matter thing kind of coincided. It was coincidence perhaps, but it also was the nature of the media almost changed as well during lockdown too. Just focusing a little bit on Black Lives Matter, do you think it's unfortunate, given the fact that you obviously believe that there is at the heart of some of the things that you're doing an opportunity to use capitalism to create social change? You know, having that incentive and that objective to make a lot of money, which is often why entrepreneurs get into business, is at the heart of capitalism and is at the heart of the whole funding issues that you're referring to. But the BLM campaign, the BLM thing, is very at the heart of some of the things that the BLM movement is demanding is fundamentally socialist and Marxist and Trotskyite almost. So has some of the arguments that the egalitarian arguments that you make so well, have they kind of fallen off the cliff in terms of Black Lives Matter? Do you believe?
Well, I don't know if there's kind of like one voice to Black Lives Matter. I think it's just kind of an umbrella for a lot of kind of disgruntled people that kind of, you know, span a spectrum. But I think though that, like, the labels don't really make any difference to me, like socialism, Marxist, whatever. I mean, if you look at kind of the American form of government and definitely the European form of government, it is something between capitalism and socialism. You know, so I mean, and these were very much responses to very particular moments in time where government realized that if it didn't provide kind of social care, then it would kind of go off a cliff, like Great Depression or whatever the case may be. So the point is that we don't have a pure capitalist system, and like we've never have. Like the system has always been a mix of the two things. The NHS is not a capitalist enterprise. If it were, it would be kind of more like the US system, where it's only kind of profit generating, and then you guys would probably say that's not the system that you want, right? So I think that it doesn't make a difference what the labels are. The point is, at the end of the day, the questions should be, what are the problems that we need to solve as a society? If we see that a disproportionate number of people are dying and we think that's a bad thing, how do we solve it? There'll be some pure market solutions. There'll be some solutions that depend more on the government. There might be a mix of the two, which is probably the right answer, but the labels are irrelevant. And I think that that's what you're seeing now, not just with Black Lives Matter, but more generally in the US. There are a lot of people who are suffering. And to your point before about kind of the socioeconomic, I wholeheartedly buy that as well. Like if you look at the US, why do people elect Trump? Well, I think it's because they're like, we're suffering and no one is talking to our pain. So we need to find some sort of radical solution because we don't want to be uneducated and have our kids not have social mobility and not have health care and not have all these things. And whether you want to call it socialist or capitalist, whatever, no one cares. The question is, I want that for me and my family. And I think you see the same thing in the UK as well, with all the people who are left behind, as the government calls it. And right now you can see that a conservative government is putting forward a lot of measures that are socialist as well, like quote unquote. Doesn't make a difference. The problem is people are suffering, government exists to solve people's problems, solve it. Afterwards, figure out what label you want to use.
But also there is the opportunity for people to solve their own problems as well. And I think the Nest sounds to me like it's a great opportunity for people, individuals who have the talent and the not necessarily the wherewithal, but certainly the intellectual wherewithal to get where they want to go. So I applaud you. It's a fabulous initiative.
No, thank you. But I mean, just to that point, like, I mean, I think I agree with you. I think that at the end of the day, you're the only one that can solve your own problems. I agree with that. But then society has to remove whatever sort of systemic barriers exist. One of the small ones that I didn't realize until I actually had to go to Oldham, because we actually had a space in Oldham as well, is how expensive it is to kind of just travel to Oldham. If I'm an entrepreneur in Oldham and I can only raise money in London, because 70% of all of the capital that's invested in startups is in London. There's nothing in Oldham. There are no business angel networks. There are no VCs. The VCs don't want to travel to me. I have to travel to them. We're the most deprived city in the whole country, but at the same time it costs us like £100 to £200 just to take a trip to London. Those are the sorts of things I think that government needs to solve. It's not a question then about the individual initiative of the entrepreneur. They're just physical barriers. And sometimes, especially if government is taking tax money in this country, like 40 to 50% sometimes, solve the problems of the people. Like, call it whatever you want to, but that's why government exists. If we could do everything by ourselves, we wouldn't need government. But the reason that we created government and give up our tax money and our liberty is because we believe that giving them sometimes 50% of your salary means that we'll have a better society. So make it a better society and stop focusing on stupid stuff. That's the way I look at it.
Gareth, thanks very much indeed.